Hello BookTube. Today I'm going to be weaponizing Michael K. Vaughan's video, Why Do I Read This Stuff? I watched it last Friday and I really enjoyed it and I thought it could bear weaponization into a sort of tag. So that's what I'm doing. So to answer Michael's question, why do I read this stuff? Um, well, I think I'm perhaps a weird case. Um, I know in like Michael's case, and I think a number of other booktubers, a lot of them they've had family influence that parents or grandparents or siblings read certain genres and their kids kind of followed suit. I didn't have that. My um, my dad was not a reader. My mom was a reader who, when I was younger, read mostly romances and has more recently, while still reading romances, also reads more thrillers. And I've never been interested in reading romances. I've tried, um, and it has not gone well. Um, uh, I tried Davy May Comber's Denim and Diamonds, and I thought it was a steaming pile of poo. All 5 seconds that I read of it. Um, and everything else I've tried, I haven't gotten on with. It's just a genre that I'm not that interested in. So, what genre do is my favorite fiction genre? Obviously, it is, even though I'm kind of on a tumultuous period with it. I am a very chaotic reader, especially the last few years. But my favorite genre of fiction has been, for most of my life, fantasy. I usually class fantasy with science fiction as science fiction and fantasy. But for the most part, fantasy is my one true love as far as fiction is concerned. Of course, science fiction, fantasy, and horror are separate genres that are lumped together because they do have common origins in the early 20th century. But anyway, so I love fantasy and I also love history, especially ancient history. So, why did I fall in love with these two genres? Well, I think it was television. It was the movies. The earliest cartoons I remember watching and absolutely loving are um, He-Man and the Masters of the Universe, She-Ra, Princess of Power. Um, Also, there was some anime that I can never remember what their title was. But of course, a lot of children's cartoons are fantastical in one way, shape, or form. But He-Man and She-Ra, and also movies, not only the Disney movies, but also the Conan movies from the 80s, Red Sonja, Beastmaster, um, Ator, although I do not recommend it, Willow, um, also Flight of Dragon, also really the Neverending Story movies, also really influenced my love of fantasy. It did take some time for me to gravitate to more adult uh, fantasy, and also eventually science fiction. I also watched Star Trek, particularly The Next Generation, Voyager, DS9, Babylon 5, and they really got me into science fiction, although not nearly as much as fantasy. So even though I came to Robert E. Howard's Conan in my 20s, I did read some of the pastiches in my teens. Um, and also, since a lot of sword and sorcery movies are set in a quasi ancient history, that really ignited a love of course, ancient history. And I've since branched out to other periods of history. Go ahead and plop up this one as an example. So I think that was the movies really ignited my love of the fantastic and also of the ancient. So moving on to comics, I want to say, while it's kind of weird. So again, no member of my family, or at least my close family, were comics readers, as far as I know of. I did have a cousin who liked comics, but we saw him I saw him once or twice a year. So, but I had a babysitter whose son was rather into comics, and I think that might maybe got me into comics as well. In that we went to, although I want to say we had comics before then, because I want to say I either had a Conan comic or a G.I. Joe comic was the first, well, both, because I remember having both. The first one that I had, I don't remember much about the Conan comic. I do remember the G.I. Joe one, which I also really loved G.I. Joe when I was a kid. Because it's the issue where one of the Crimson Vipers shoots the original Cobra Commander and eventually takes his place. But I think my babysitter's son got me more fully into comics. We would go to our Toys R Us, and they used to have some like comics in boxes that you could pick up. Also, there were comic book shops. There was particularly one that was in the same strip mall as the optometrist that we went to. So we would go in there. And there were a few other, and are still a few comic book stores in Waco. So that kind of fed my interest. And I amass a fairly small collection. It was maybe one or two of those boxes. But I fell out of comics in my mid-teens, largely because the comic book stores, particularly the one that was my go-to, closed, and I think they transitioned into a gaming store. And the other comic book store in Waco, it was rather distant. And then and so I fell out of comics and I got rid of that collection. And then I kind of came back to comics in my mid 20s. And then I kind of fell out of comics again. And then I kind of got back into it a few years later, but I fell out of it again in my early 30s. So, yeah. And I don't actively collect comics, although I sometimes wish I did. I do regret having kind of given up the active collecting. I mean, I still read comics on American superhero comics on occasion, although I have to basically use the Kindle, which I am not a fan of at all. Particularly when you're trying to go to the next page and you accidentally blow up one of the panels and you can't get it back to where it was. It infuriates me. So yeah. So moving on to manga. Um, I think some of the anime I watched when I was really young that I don't quite recall, as well as later, really got me into manga later on. Although I came to manga late. I was in my uh, late 20s, mid to late 20s, when I first got the manga bug, and then it's just recently that I really decided to get back into it and having a ball with it. So that's fantasy, kind of sort of science fiction, history, and comics and manga. So what else do I read? Well, I do read canonical works, although very rarely, and I don't quite naturally gravitate towards them. I have a very small collection that I would like to expand. I just need to figure out how I want to do that because I don't have much space. And yeah, it's going to be an interesting fight. Um, Especially when I do have this tendency where I can at times be ruthless in sending books away if I have easy access to send them on their way, which I don't currently have. But at the same time, I do regret it. So there is always that worry. I mean, I do regret getting rid of my comic book collections. I do regret having gotten rid of my earlier manga collection. A lot of the classics, canonical, modern, and contemporary fiction, poetry, drama that I've had and I've gotten rid of, I do regret getting rid of. So there's always a concern. But why? So what got me into canonical um, and modern and contemporary uh, fiction, poetry, and drama? Well, I think as far as classics and canonical, um, I think it was my desire to be a professor. Um, I really enjoyed to read, and I was talked into briefly. Um, well, no, I don't think that really quite worked. Hmm. Now that I think about it, I'm not entirely sure why I ended up being an English lit major rather than a history major. Keeping in mind, of course, the English department and the English lit department at my alma mater was much better than the history department. No offense to them, but yeah. So I'm not entirely sure what inspired me to focus more to major in English literature than history, which, thinking back on it, probably would have made a lot more sense. And I'm not entirely sure what. Well, I think to a certain extent, I've always had, as much as I am drawn to the fantastic, there is also a part of me that is rather drawn to the mundane as well, to the realistic. And that tendency, I think, inspired me to ultimately major in English literature, and with a desire to eventually being an academic, a professor, which never happened. But anyway, so I think that's kind of why I did, and I do on occasion, well, as I've talked about before, I do have a complicated relationship with the literature of the mundane, as Michael K. Vaughan terms it, which I actually love. That is a really good and interesting way of terming like realistic fiction or general fiction or literary fiction, because it does sort of turn that snobbery on its head, doesn't it? But I do have a complicated relationship with it, like I've repeated several times. And I'm not entirely sure why. I keep coming back to it, but I do. And I guess it's because while for the most part I don't get on with it, and to be quite fair, I am an incredibly harsh critic. I am incredibly harsh. So it's not surprising that I bail as heavily as I do. A book has to be really, really good for me not to bail, or I have to really like it, I think, for me not, excuse me, not to want to bail on it. And that happens quite a lot. But when it works, and in a different way than when it really works with, like, say, fantasy. Fantasy can get the hairs standing on end, and you're just taken away in a zone. While when it works, as far as, say, literary fiction, the literature of the mundane, when it works, it's a bit more intellectual enjoyment, I would say. I don't think I quite get the same hair raising parts of it. Excuse me. So, yeah, I think that's kind of why I read classics, canonical, modern, contemporary fiction, poetry, drama. Although I think I maybe need to do that a bit more in moderation, but we shall see. So anyway, that was my probably rather clumsy attempt to explain why I read this stuff. But if you would like to make a similar video, consider yourselves tagged. And I will see you tomorrow with probably another tag video. And then I'm not entirely sure what else is jumping out at me that I would like to do this BookTube week. So anyway, I'll see what I can come up with. But anyway, I'm starting to ramble, and I need to go get work to. I need to go get some work done on a review for Steve. So until I see you tomorrow, thank you, BookTube. Have a great afternoon and stay safe.